Hey fearsome friends. Now I can't even imagine what it's like having someone so obsessed with you that they follow your every move. These people certainly do though. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. It happened in 2002 when I was living in a ground floor apartment in the corner of an L-shaped building with the living room, kitchen, parents' bedroom on the garden balcony side, and my sister's bedroom and bathroom were on the parking side. I was 7 years old at the time of the story, and all this happened over several weeks, maybe months, but I hope not. At the beginning of summer 2002, I was often playing in the common gardens of the building with other children that lived there, when one afternoon, my mother called me and my friends to ask us if it was us who would have taken one of her pairs of panties that was drying on the floor of our terrace to play with, which of course we were told that it was not a done thing to play with women's underwear. But it wasn't us. As the weeks went by, several similar incidents were reported to us, but always without explanation. Sometime after these events, my father, who wasn't sleeping well, one evening decided to smoke a cigarette at the kitchen window, which was on the garden side, and looked around to clear his mind a bit. But as he looked closer towards our right neighbour's terrace, my father could see a man standing there, not moving, and looking into their apartment. My father, thinking it was the neighbour, said, "What are you doing, bud?" The person turned around and looked at my father, and he was touching himself. Then, without saying anything, the intruder ran through the hedge and left through the common gardens. The whole neighbourhood was informed of what had happened, and they decided that this needed to stop now. Us children were forbidden to play outside in the evening, and a feeling of fear settled in amongst the people of the ground floor. During the year, a new neighbour moved into the apartment above ours. Alerted and a little shocked by the incessant theft of women's underwear in our building, my neighbour, legally with good reason, bought a dissuasion gun, which shoots and weighs like a real one, but shoots blanks, and she kept it in her bedside table. Now this neighbour loved animals and had 2 parakeets, which often made a lot of noise, and they were in a birdcage on her balcony, and she also had cats and fish. One evening, this neighbour came back from work and put her things down, going about her life like any other person coming home from work. But that evening, she noticed that on her balcony, unfortunately the birdcage was open, and her parakeets had disappeared. Thinking it was her own mistake, she was very sad, but felt there was no reason to be afraid. Later on that evening, she'd gone to bed and fallen asleep, but she was suddenly awoken during the night. Firstly, she felt her comforter being pulled slightly, and thinking it was her cat, she held the comforter tightly, but it still was being pulled. She felt the bed move and a breath behind her. There was someone with her in bed. The feeling of fear took hold, and she jumped out of bed whilst opening her bedside table, taking out her pistol, and fired twice in the direction of the man, who fled by jumping out of the bedroom window, which was open. The whole building was awakened by the shots, including my father, who saw a man land in front of our terrace and run into the gardens. My father grabbed what he could and chased him, and the police eventually stopped my father, who was running in his underwear with a golf putter. My father then had to explain to the police that he was just the neighbour, and a couple of minutes later, the police informed us that the man had been arrested in the housing estate next to us by a patrol that was doing their rounds of the neighbourhood. We later found out that the culprit was a man of 45 years, married, a father of 3 children, and had already been convicted of several acts of voyeurism and break-ins. He had even entered a lady's house on the 4th floor by climbing up the balcony. Unfortunately, though, no charges were attained against him, because A, he hadn't broken into my neighbour's house, B, he hadn't assaulted her, raped, or even touched her, and C, they weren't even sure that the thefts were necessarily attributed to him. So here we are, living in a country where a person with serious voyeuristic urges that will inevitably lead to other more serious crimes cannot be thrown in jail, because technically he didn't do anything. This first encounter happened in broad daylight after class had finished, and I was at the grocery store picking up some snacks. Just then, I felt as if someone was staring at me, and that's when I met the eyes of an old man. We made eye contact a few more times. I thought nothing of it and just walked home. On my way, I had this strong sensation that someone was staring at me behind my back. So I glanced around, and lo and behold, the old man was there. It was just the two of us along that street, so the panic began to set in. I started walking faster and glanced back again, and he was walking faster too. Panic then turned to fear as I screamed at him, "Stop following me!" "I just want to get to know you," he answered, and I ran with him on my heels all the way home. I slammed the door behind me, but he rang the doorbell. I was terrified by this time and told my mum that an old guy had followed me home. My mum, however, instead of going outside to scold him, laughed and told me it was nice that I had an admirer. What the hell? She even opened the door and talked to him. I was horrified beyond belief. What he said next rendered me speechless, as he mentioned my name, my school, what degree I was studying, all of my classes and what time they were scheduled. I had no idea how he knew all this. He just wanted to get to know me, and I wasn't even 18. My mum shut the door and found it all funny, and I cried. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. He'd follow me to school and always tried to talk to me, even if I was doing my best to get away from him. Wherever I was, he was there. And to be honest, he looked weird, like he was crazy or something. One time he followed me to a bus I was catching, so I ran to get inside, and of course he followed me on. I screamed and told him to back the F away, but he kept on talking to me. I was pissed and afraid, and everyone there was just looking at us. No one was helping me, nor was anyone stopping him. At the time I was interning at a local radio station that a TV network owned, and before my stop, I got off and ran like crazy. He was running behind me, but as I was quicker than him, I managed to get to the TV network first and told him off in front of the guards by the gate. I then ran inside and watched from afar as the guards prevented him from going any further. He was raising his voice, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. He was pointing at me, and I stayed with my fellow interns until 6 a.m. the following day, where we left together and I thankfully didn't see him. The stalking continued still, and I was scared shitless, because he'd also managed to get my number. I changed it, of course, and started making sure I was around others more, and I changed my class schedule. We also moved to a new house and got a family car that I used to drive to school in, because I was too afraid to use any public transport. I also stopped going to the grocery where I first saw him. Years passed by without me seeing him, until one day, that is. I was now a graduate and working and had a boyfriend, who, by the way, is now my husband. He'd drive me to the train station so I could go to work, and the car had tinted windows. From the outside, all you could see was a mirror. One day I was in the passenger seat and there was a bus in front of us. I got that feeling again of being watched, so I took a look at the passengers until I noticed this old man, staring. It was him, and I was horrified. He looked older and more bald, but that face and that stare were still exactly the same. I thought he couldn't see me, but I was obviously wrong. He was staring right at me through the tinted glass, and I have no idea how he'd seen me, because the glass was mirror-like, like the ones in those crime shows. I told my boyfriend about it, and he got mad and asked me where he was, so I pointed at the old man. He didn't care and just kept staring as he was so surprised to see me again. The bus kept on its route, and the old man wanted to get off, but he couldn't. I had my heart in my throat and was terrified. I actually had a hard time breathing and felt that fear I'd had the first time I was running away from him. That was the last time I saw the old creeper, and his name was Hubert. I remembered from one of the times he'd tried talking to me, and I will never forget it. So I'm quite an awkward person and can struggle to make friends due to my shyness. So in late 2019 to early 2020, I decided to join my sixth form's D&D club. I was hooked, and the fact that I had met a very lovely girl there, who I'll refer to as May, made it all the more enjoyable. It was the type of new friendship where all you want to do is spend time with your new bestie. And so, when May asked me to join their D&D party, I was overjoyed. I really did like her. She started off a little awkward, as was I, but she was really sweet and understanding, and we ended up having a lot of our more nerdy interests in common. The first time we hung out on our own was a lot more uncomfortable than I was expecting. Of course, as we had only been friends for a couple of weeks, so I knew it would be a little awkward, but I was not expecting how terribly unpleasant it turned out to be. We didn't seem to click for some reason. Everything was fine when we were in a group, but one-on-one, May was strange. She would completely ignore me for no reason all of a sudden, make very odd jokes but in a serious manner, leaving the pause a little too long, and would then laugh, as well as other strange mannerisms. That was just before I left sixth form early due to personal reasons. It wasn't super off-putting. I wanted to get closer to her, believing once she got used to me maybe she'll mellow out a bit. But boy, was I so wrong. Once I did officially leave school, May became intense. It started out with her asking to meet up every other day, keeping in mind I had started work full-time by this point and had very little time to see people. Which was fine, because she'd understand that I was busy, right? Wrong. She started getting annoyed and upset to an inappropriate level. For example, she would make me send a picture of my calendar to prove I was too busy to see her, and even when she could see it was chock-a-block, she would start to try and manipulate me and make me feel bad for not being able to see her, messaging me things like, "I love you, but you're so difficult to meet up with," calling me her best friend, and telling me she was crying because she couldn't see me. These conversations would happen around 2 to 3 times a week, and honestly, I started getting creeped out. By this point, we had only known each other for around 2 to 3 months. We had met up alone around 5 to 6 times, and had seen each other almost every day at school before my departure. My creeper meter had started to rise, but it wasn't at a point where I wanted to end the friendship. Sure, it was annoying of how possessive she was, but it's not like she was stalking me. Yet. I distanced myself from her a little, just for my own sanity, as her neediness had progressively gotten more intense, and it had become taxing on my mental health. But I still wanted to be friends with her, as underneath everything, May really was lovely. But that was until they came to my house for the first time, back when I was living with my parents. May turned up a lot later than we'd agreed, which peeved me a little, as they knew I had work the next day. But it wasn't a biggie. And that's when the really uncomfortable comments started. Now, my parents' house is very nice. It's big. They have a gym and a hot tub and a lovely garden, etc. By this point, I was used to friends making a couple of comments like, "Wow, your house is so nice," or "Damn, I love your house." My favourite was probably when my cousin compared the house's size to a horse. Now that's funny. But May wouldn't stop. She would drop how large or nice she thought my house was in every other sentence, which later developed to her slating the house and my parents' jobs constantly, telling me that I was shoving my parents' wealth in her face, or that my parents got their money because they take advantage of vulnerable children. Please keep in mind that I had not spoken about my parents' money or the family home once in this conversation, because talking about private things like that is very uncomfortable for me. Then she started to get even stranger, asking me to cuddle and spoon and telling me that I couldn't escape, going on about how was I really happy with my boyfriend, then making jokes that didn't feel like jokes, at my expense. I was very uneasy, and my parents could see it too. So after that day, I told May that I was way too busy to meet up, so to stop asking me. But she didn't. She started making jokes that because I wouldn't see her, she would just show up at my house and catch me off guard. She even changed her jog route so she ran past my parents' house every day. And then she started messaging my boyfriend. It was completely out of the blue, and I hadn't given her his social media or name. I hadn't even really discussed my relationship with her at all. It was very uncomfortable for everyone involved, and my boyfriend was obviously not interested in being her friend due to how uncomfortable she made me. She told him things like, "You need my permission to date OP because I'm her best friend. And you have to be friends with me and like me because I'm OP's best friend." We're not best friends. She would spam my phone with messages, and I would reply around twice a month. I was completely smothered. It was so strange, but when I received a screenshot of their conversation from my boyfriend because he was creeped out, I was livid. The screenshot showed them having a very one-sided conversation on her behalf, where all of a sudden she told him she loved him. I didn't know what to say, and neither did he, so I confronted her. May tried to turn it around on me and said, and I quote, "I was talking to your boyfriend, and he knew about me." Impossible. I figured out you'd talked about me without my consent. Heartbroken. It was surreal. I told her that I had mentioned that we met up, and that she was a friend from school, which was true. Of course I had told him that she made me uncomfortable, but she didn't know that, and the conversation ended there. Then she went off to uni and we didn't speak for a while. It was so relaxing. All the anxiety around the situation faded. May had made new friends and I was free. But when she came home for Christmas, everything started up again, and all that anxiety came back. I was going through a really tough time, so me and my mum went away for a few days. But when I didn't respond to May for 3 days because I was busy, she went crazy. She spammed me on every social media I have daily: Instagram, Snapchat, Discord, text message, and more. The messages started off normally, with her asking if we could meet up, and that she was home from uni. But they gradually became angry, and I won't lie, it was scary. I believed her when she said she would just show up at my house, and I was terrified that she'd asked my friends for my new address, under the pretense that I had forgotten to give it to her, as they had threatened to do this in joking form before. It felt obsessive and I didn't know what to do. She wouldn't stop messaging me, and it became a constant stream of creepy messages. So I exploded at her and told her that this behavior was creepy and that I have never been made to feel this uncomfortable by someone. I also said she didn't have boundaries and I was scared about the joke disguised threats that she'd made. I finished it off with the fact that I didn't want to see her again, and could she please stop messaging me. I could have definitely been nicer about it, but that never seemed to work in our prior conversations when I had to defend why I was busy and couldn't see her. Her response was so strange. She became incredibly apologetic, then got angry, then started to try and manipulate me into meeting up, apologizing, and putting herself down, and then telling me that she loved me. I was so over all her nonsense and weird behaviors. I felt bad for her. I had wanted to be her friend so much, but she was obsessive and overbearing, and even though I tried for so long to make it work, she had ended up pushing me away because of her behavior. I do wish her well, and I hope she gets help for whatever is going on with her. But creepy stalker friend, you're definitely not my cup of tea. Please stay the hell away from me. So I work late a lot, and tonight as I was coming around the corner from where I get off my train stop, a guy making a turn across the intersection hollered at me, I made the mistake of saying hello back, because I'm a nice person, and it's just my natural instinct. But I knew I'd messed up bad when I saw he'd started making a U-turn. So I quickly crossed the street, hoping that since he would be on the other side, I would lose him as it's a really busy main street. But I didn't. He made another U-turn at the next light and pulled directly up beside me. I screamed at him to leave me alone and started walking even more quickly, but not running yet because I didn't want him to see where I was going to turn to walk into my neighborhood. Somehow he'd managed to make another, very illegal and dangerous U-turn to end up directly beside me, right at the entrance to my block. But luckily he got caught at a red light, and I realized right then just how sketchy this was and how much danger I could have possibly been in. So I started sprinting as fast as I could, just hoping and praying I could make it to my house and to safety before that signal turned green and he was after me again. Thank God there were some guys outside of the apartment complex, because when they saw me running, and I told them someone was following me, they stepped to the sidewalk and started looking down where he was turning from, right at that moment. They scared him off a bit as he pulled into a parking lot adjacent to where I was heading, instead of still following me into a now much darker and less populated area. I made it inside and started crying, and not a minute later, I saw headlights pass by my front windows. So I looked out and it was the same car, on my exact street, driving past my house. He must have pulled through the parking lot and proceeded in the same direction that I was obviously going from the opposite way, hoping to catch me before I made it home. I was in tears as no one I live with was validating how serious and scary this was. I live in a major city, and the street he followed me on for the majority of the time is incredibly busy and well lit. There's bars everywhere, and it was Friday night, but he didn't care. He could tell I was a young woman alone at night and heading home, and he'd planned on following me all the way there. I may have made it home, but he drove on my street, he drove by my house, and I don't know when I will feel safe again. And the worst part is, I have to work this late every day. This is not okay. This world is not safe. I didn't deserve this, and now I have to live in fear and he gets to know where I live. None of this is fair. So this happened to me in the summer of 2015, when I was dating a guy who lived in the city, and I was living at home at the time in the suburbs. Neither of us had a car, and since I lived at home with my bedroom right next to my grandma's, I always went to him. I'd take the subway to his place every week and stay for the couple of days I had off work, and to get to his apartment it required taking 2 trains. One day I was headed over to see him, and it was really hot out. I was wearing a skirt with straps, a crop top, and knee-high socks, as I wanted to look cute, and I guess I feel that this is important to mention, as I probably stood out in this outfit. Unfortunately though, in hindsight, I probably should have been more careful about what I was wearing, which sucks. I was on the first train, and after a few stops I noticed a man get on. I kind of couldn't not have noticed him, as he chose to stand right in front of where I was sitting and stare at me, rather than take an empty seat. It made me feel weird, as the man in general gave me a very creepy vibe. He was probably in his 40s and looked unkempt, but otherwise he was kind of just a basic-looking dude, whose face I can't even picture now. So I got off at the last stop and headed through the station to where I needed to catch the second train, but I noticed this guy was following me, which at first I figured wasn't a big deal, as he could have just been going to the same place. So to get to the platform I needed, you have to go up some stairs, and that's when I realized he was right behind me. I decided to turn around and go to a different platform, which happened to be packed with people, thinking that if he followed me, then this is bad, but maybe I can lose him in a crowd. He followed me, and I tried to duck out of view before going back to the actual platform I needed to be. I finally got there, and for a few minutes I felt better. until I saw him again. He must have known I'd be there after I'd gone up and then turned around. Plus it was the only other platform, and most likely he'd seen me the whole time. There weren't too many people waiting compared to the other side, but a few trains came that were so full I didn't bother try to get on them, and neither did he. The whole time this was going on, I was texting my boyfriend, who was not taking me seriously at all. I asked if he'd at least meet me at the station when I got to the stop by his apartment, which is a 5-minute walk. He was being reluctant but agreed finally, and at this point I was still waiting for a train when one came that was very full. I was getting restless and wanted to get to a safe place, so I squeezed on, and so did the man, right next to me with his arm over me. I decided then that even with all these people around, I wasn't safe. So right before the doors closed, I hopped out and the train left with the guy on it staring at me as it pulled away. I waited for a few more trains to come and go, worried the guy would be waiting for me at the next stop. Then I got on a train finally, paying attention to everyone who got on at each stop. He never did, thankfully, and I made it to my stop and was greeted by my boyfriend, who seemed put out by having to walk over. Needless to say, he is now an ex and was generally kind of shitty. I'm really proud of myself for getting off that train at the last second, and I don't know how much danger I was actually in. But I know that man was following me, and it definitely wasn't for any wholesome reason. And despite being in public, I feel like if he had tried something, no one would have done anything, and I'm a very small person. This happened to me when I was still in high school, and I was around 16, I believe. My friend and I at the time used to go to the mall regularly, and I'm talking 3 times a week, sometimes more. We loved walking around shopping, and this was around the time of the semi-formal, so we went there in hopes of buying a dress. My friend was usually late when we made plans, and this particular day was no exception. So I decided to walk around by myself and go into a few stores to pass the time, and kept checking my phone, hoping to get a message from her to say that she had arrived, so I was mildly distracted. The mall wasn't too busy either, as it was a weekday. I was in a store called Forever 21, casually looking at clothes, when I noticed 2 men who looked to be in their 30s, and they were sort of staring at me. I tried convincing myself that it was in my head, and that they were probably looking at something else. But nonetheless, I was getting a little bit insecure and uncomfortable, so I just shrugged it off and walked into another store. I was swatching and looking at makeup and was beginning to forget about the 2 guys, when I noticed after about 10 minutes that they had walked into the same store as me. They were keeping their distance, but still staring at me, and at this point I was thinking, I'm sure it was just a coincidence. But I still made the decision to walk out of the store, just for some peace of mind. I was then standing around some benches, and checked my phone again to see if my friend had sent me a message, but there was nothing. A few seconds after that, I noticed the men were walking out of the store staring me down, whilst walking quickly towards me. At this point I knew they were shady as hell, so I quickly started walking away. But again, these men were following me. I tried to keep my cool, but I was starting to panic. I'd started running at this point, and thankfully as I turned a corner, the nearest store was a Victoria's Secret, so I bolted to the back of it, which is where the changing rooms were. Like I said, it wasn't a busy day, so there was no one in line waiting to try anything on. There were 2 workers just casually talking to one another, and when I ran up, I think I may have startled them, as I was panting and shaking. But I managed to say, "I think I'm being followed. Can I please hide?" Before going into hiding, and it all happened so quickly. The worker didn't even say yes. She just nodded and quickly led me to a changing room. I hid in there for what felt like forever, but had probably only been about 5 minutes in reality. The girl that led me to a changing room came to knock and see if I was all right, and the other girl who was with her came up to the door also. I explained what had happened and they seemed shocked. She said I could wait there as long as I needed until my friend showed up. And they also said that they'd seen a man casually walking near the back, but left very shortly after. My friend eventually came and we had no issues afterwards. But that was by far one of the scariest encounters I'd ever had. I'm so grateful for the two girls in the store. I don't know what the intentions of the two men were, but I'm happy I didn't find out. This happened about 8 years ago when I was a senior in high school. My neighborhood was very quiet and safe, and I went to a small school, and one day I had study hall for the last part of the school day, so I decided to head out about 90 minutes before the final bell. As such, the roads weren't very crowded, so I hopped in my ancient Ford Taurus and headed home to start getting ready for work. As I passed a grocery store near the turn into my neighborhood, an unmarked white construction van pulled out behind me. I took a slight right towards my neighborhood and he followed. At first I didn't find it strange, because there were a lot of houses back here. But as I drove towards the back of the neighborhood and he didn't turn, I had my eye on him. My neighborhood was shaped like a giant horseshoe, with roads cutting through the middle, and if the two entrances were the points of the horseshoe, my house was directly in the center of the U. Because of this, if you didn't live on my street or have business with someone on my street, there was no reason for you to be there. If you drove through, you'd spit out where you started. He followed me onto my street, so I figured it was probable that he was just doing work on one of my neighbor's houses, but I had a bad feeling in my gut. I drove by my house without stopping, and he followed. Once I'd come out the other side of my street and he was still following, I knew he was probably intentionally tailing me. My gut sank and I white-knuckled my steering wheel. To confirm this, I started taking random turns, and after 3 or 4, he was still right behind me. I decided I was going to drive to the police station, as I obviously couldn't go home. At pretty much that exact moment, he must have realized I knew he was up to something, because he hit the gas, his engine revved, and he floored it out of the neighborhood. I then breathed a sigh of relief and went home. Thinking back, I still could have gone to the station to file a report, but my dumb teenage brain was probably preoccupied with getting to work on time. I hate to think about what he might have wanted to do, and I'm extremely thankful that I was paying attention whilst I was driving. But maybe I misread the situation. I guess I'll never know. My ex-best friend, Elisa, and I were friends for almost 7 years. We had a good, healthy relationship, and she was my ride or die. We did everything together, but we slowly started to drift apart when I exchanged schools. We'd see each other after school, so it was cool. But a year passed and I started to notice Elisa hanging around with the wrong crowd, which I didn't want any part of. I started to notice how Elisa would pick on me about my appearance and clothing, but she used to dress like me. We used to be draped in anime merch, but ever since she started to hang out with a more mature college crowd, she'd changed. She would constantly tell me I was fat, ugly, and nobody loved me, all that type of stuff. The last straw was, though, when she called my family poor, and I lost it because my family had helped her with financial problems and even gotten them out of debt. So I stopped being friends with her, and I started to hang out with new people and get to know myself more. I have made a new best friend, and everything was great, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched from every corner. I always felt like someone was there, but I ignored it initially. Months passed and I still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and that's when stuff started to happen. My car would end up keyed, my tires were popped most of the time, and weird letters I had to decipher started to show up on my front porch. But I'm dumb, and decided to ignore it all. A year later, I decided to hang out with some old friends from the group, and that's when I found out everything. Alyssa had been the one doing those things to me, and every letter she sent was a death threat. My friend Tori, the one who witnessed everything, told me how Alyssa would stalk me and get mad that I'd replaced her with a guy. That's not what creeped me out, though. It turned out Alyssa had copied everything. I got a 2018 Nissan Sentra, and she got the same car. Inside on my dashboard, I have my Hero Academia figures and South Park figures, and she went as far as to get the same type of figures online and put them on her dashboard too. She would wake up at 6 a.m, drive to my house and wait for me to wake up and get out of the house so she could follow me. She tried adding my friends on social media and tried to convince them to leave me for her because she was a better friend than me. She even got the same clothes as I did. According to Tori, when she would visit Alyssa at her house, Alyssa would have the same anime posters too. I didn't believe her at first, until she showed me the pictures, and everything was the same, as if Tori was seeing double of everything. Luckily for me, Alyssa was forced to move up north with her father, as her grandma had kicked her out the house and everything went back to normal. Well, for now. I'm just scared when she comes over for holidays, she'll start stalking me again. I used to live in a small suburb with many middle-class families that had 3-bedroom houses. It was the least scary place you could live, and crime was mainly just teenagers doing stupid things and drugs. We lived a block from the local convenience store, and when I was 10 or 11, my dad sent me to get him some snacks. I was pissed about it, as it was the middle of a day on the weekend, and I wanted to be playing, not fetching Doritos. But I reluctantly went after having arguing with my dad. My sister felt bad as my dad had been a jerk to me, so she volunteered to go with me, which was an incredibly sweet gesture that actually saved my life. We went to the store, grabbed the snacks and left. However, on the way back from the store, which is just a short walk, we were on the opposite side of the street from our block and coming up to a giant hedge tree in a neighbour's yard. It was huge from lack of trimming, and as we approached it, my sister started to freak out. We had been chatting about whatever nonsense, and she stopped mid-sentence, grabbed my arm and started to pull me across the street, saying, "Let's go, we gotta cross." I tried to stop her and ask what was wrong, as I thought she had some health concern or something, and we were within sight of our house. We had always been taught to walk at the crosswalk, so when she started pulling me across the middle of the street, I was trying to tell her we weren't at the crosswalk yet. I kept asking her what was wrong, but had stopped fighting her, as I wanted us both to cross the street safely. She kept saying wait, and we were now standing in front of our neighbour's house, and she turned me around, pointed at the bush and told me to wait. We were standing there for less than 30 seconds, before a man in his 20s or 30s started to slowly climb out of the bushes, dressed head to toe in black. He was looking all around him nervously to check if anyone was watching him. And almost fully out of the bush now, he saw us watching him and took off running down the street into the neighbourhood. It turned out my sister saw the bushes move as we'd approached and thought it was weird. But as we got closer, she saw the man and knew he was up to no good. I'm so thankful she was there with me that day, as I never would have seen him. I would have still been pissed and grumbling that I had to go to the store in the first place, so I don't like to imagine what could have happened. So after spending a couple of hours walking all over Balboa Park, 2 of my friends and I came to a bench and sat down for a while to take pictures and relax. There was a guy sitting a few benches over. The benches were arranged in a circle around a gazebo, and something about him caught my attention. I felt the need to keep glancing over at him. After a little while, one of my friends said he had to head out. So my other friend and I said goodbye and decided we would go check out a different part of the park. The guy was still at the benches when we walked away, and my friend and I were walking around our new spot for a few minutes when we decided to head back in the direction of the benches. As we walked back, we crossed paths with the guy from before, and me and him locked eyes. In that moment, my blood ran inexplicably cold, and I seriously almost threw up on the spot. He kept going his way and we kept going ours, but once my friend and I were far enough away from him, I told her that something about the guy we passed just made me feel really uneasy, and I wanted to get back to the more populated part of the park, as far away from him as possible. We started heading back down the way we'd initially come, stopped at a few shops and a museum, and eventually ended up taking a seat because we needed a break from walking. For reference, this is a main entrance to the park, and there are lots of pillars around with seats under each one. And not 2 minutes after we'd sat down, all of the seats and all the people in that area and the guy from before came up from the same direction we had, ready to keep going, and sat directly across from us, looking right at us as he did so. My friend and I both looked at each other wide-eyed, and my friend asked if I was ready to keep going. I said yes, so we hauled ass to my car and got out of there. It turned out my friend hadn't even realized at first that it was the same guy who'd freaked me out before. She was just creeped out by him herself. It could have been a coincidence, as maybe he just happened upon us again and just thought he'd sit by us because he'd recognized us from before. But the timing seemed very exact, like he'd followed us to that point. The distance from where we'd first seen him to where we'd last seen him was pretty far. That, paired with the awful feeling I'd gotten when I made eye contact with him, makes me wonder if something sinister was going on. Though I'm not sure what this guy could have been planning to do in a crowded park in the middle of the day. In 2014, I moved to England from Canada to gain work and travel experience, and also to find myself. I ended up living in Essex with 3 other roommates who were all women, and all a bit older than I was. I was 24 at the time, Megan was 31, Cherry was 34, and Cassie was 38. Megan was from New York, Cherry from New Jersey, and Cassie from Poland, and all 4 of us shared this 3-story flat. At the back of it was the living room and kitchen, and the back wall was glass that looked out into the garden, which was completely fenced in. The house had an interesting dynamic, to say the least, and I have tons of stories from that time in my life. I adored all of my roommates, except for Cherry, and after living with her for 7 months, I was over her antics. One day when I came home from work, I locked the door, made myself something to eat, and went up to bed. I'd brought some work home with me, so I was in my nightie with all these papers around me and my headphones on, jamming out. I had them on because Cherry was out to dinner with work friends, and that meant booze, and then soon after that a tantrum was surely to come. I just didn't want to have to listen to her crazy scream crying. So I was working away and completely focused, until I felt something. I looked up to see a man standing over me. I didn't register it right away, and passively said, "Cherry's room's on the 2nd floor," and continued on with my work. Cherry regularly brought strange men home, but he didn't leave. Again I said, "Cherry's room is downstairs. He then interrupted me. "I'm not here for Cherry," he said. A cold chill iced my veins, and my fight or flight kicked in, and I started surveying the situation. I looked him up and down, and he had a bottle of Prosecco in one hand and a knife in the other. He was about 5'10", wild muddy brown hair with black eyes, and he had a light blue polo shirt on. One side of his collar was popped up, and he had a distinct Manchester accent. Once I focused in, I realized his eyes were black because his pupils were completely dilated. I was in trouble, and I needed an escape plan. Unfortunately, this man was standing in between me and my bedroom door, so I couldn't get to the stairs. But I needed for him to think it was his idea, so I decided to play along. Just then he used his knife to pop the cork, and Prosecco started flowing onto my carpet. I said, "Oh no, let's clean that up. I prefer to drink out of a proper flute anyways." He nodded, replying, "Yeah, you're a proper classy bird. Let's go." I tried to act as naturally as possible, not to show that I was shaking all over, and I tried to gain control over my breathing. We took the long journey down to the main floor of my flat, which is all 3 floors, and he had the back of my nightie bunched up in one hand. I could feel the point of the knife grazing my back with his other, and I was trying to playfully talk to him as we walked down the stairs, but I couldn't tell you what I was saying. I was most likely rambling, and I couldn't hear anything over my heart beating in my ears. We got to the bottom of the stairs where there is a hallway to my left that leads to the front door. On my right, which was much closer to us, is the kitchen and living room. We made our way into the kitchen, and I pointed to the cabinets that had the wine glasses. He said he knew where they were and started towards them, and I now had the kitchen table in between us. It was time to run. I burst into a sprint down the hallway towards the door, my hands fumbling over the locks, shaking and sweating. I swung open the door to see 2 men walking across the street. They must have been walking home from the train, as there was a big station in front of our place. I called out to them for help, and suddenly I was flung onto the ground. Little pebbles were piercing my skin, and sent sharp pains where they jabbed. The intruder pushed me out of the way to run and escape, and one of the men chased after him, whilst the other said for me to go inside while he surveyed my home and called the police. I locked the doors and immediately called the police, and while on the phone with dispatch, I manically ran around the house to double-check everything was locked, when suddenly I heard a loud bang on my door. I informed the dispatch of the banging, and she told me that police weren't there yet. I thought it might be one of the gentlemen who'd helped me that was at the door, so I went to look out the eye-hole, and it was him, the intruder. He'd come back and was banging on my door, screaming that I had his glasses and that he was not done with me. I absolutely freaked out, and the dispatcher attempted to calm me down, but I was losing my ever-loving mind. She then said, "They're pulling onto your street now. You should hear their sirens." And I did. Thank God for that. The intruder then blasted off. One officer jumped out of the passenger side whilst the car was still moving and chased after him. The second officer came into my home, interviewed me and the 2 gentlemen, collected evidence and took photos. After some time of him being there, Cherry came home and freaked out. Once the situation was explained to her, she said, "Oh my God, that could have been me." "Yeah, thanks Cherry, it's all about you." The next morning I was called in to identify a man they had in custody, and I pointed him out. I went into a little room, and the officer pulled out an evidence bag and asked me if the items were mine. They were. There were my underwear and photos taken from my home. The officer informed me that the intruder had been stalking me for some time, and estimated it had been 3 months. He had made a nest outside our home on top of a hill that overlooked into our living room and kitchen. He is a known sex offender and drug dealer, and the police then told me how lucky I was to get out practically unharmed. But others hadn't been so lucky. Every day I'm thankful for the 2 gentlemen that saved me that night. This happened when I was in my early 20s, and in those days I was working in a small sales office in my town. One of my hobbies is to travel alone, as I really enjoy my freedom. In addition to the normal national holidays which my company offers, I would also travel on weekdays using my annual leave. People at work would ask me, "Where are you going this time?" And I would always reply something along the lines of, "That's a secret, but you'll find out when I bring in the souvenirs." I always brought back sweets or chocolate from wherever I went. I was never wary of telling people at work where I was going. I just hated the advice that people gave when they'd find out my destination, as I want my own experience. People would say, "This place is good," or "If you're going there, you gotta try this restaurant," and "Make sure you check out this place." I don't want all that, so I prefer to keep my holiday destination a secret. So the day of my holiday arrived and I was on my way, heading northeast on the expressway. Unfortunately, there was heavy traffic that day because of an accident up ahead, so I was really disappointed, as it was eating into my holiday. I restlessly looked around to switch into a faster lane, and since I didn't have much else to do, I looked in my side mirrors to see how far the traffic was stretched back behind me. That's when I noticed something in my left-hand mirror, 2 cars behind me. The driver of that car looked a hell of a lot like one of my male co-workers. The reason why I suspected it was him was because he was, shall we say, unique in appearance and attitude. I mean unique in a slightly negative way, though. And also, he had a quirky haircut at the time, so he wasn't exactly hard to miss. I managed to get past the accident and felt like I didn't want to catch eyes with the guy. So I tried to keep a distance between our cars, as I felt weird about seeing him going the same way I was. As I kept driving, I thought that I might have been overthinking things or being too self-conscious, but my initial fears were confirmed when I pulled into a rest stop and saw my co-worker's car pull into the same place. I still thought that I could be overreacting, but I found it weird that he'd parked far away from my car. I went to use the restroom, and to ease my own mind, I kept my eye on his car, expecting him to come out of it, but he didn't. When I came back from the bathroom, I glanced towards his car and saw him sat in the same position that he was in when he arrived. It looked as if he'd never left his car. I felt as if there was something up, and in the pit of my stomach I knew when I left the parking area he would too. I could just sense it. I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes, but I didn't see him leave. My car was facing the only exit of the rest area, so I decided to turn in my seat and check very quickly, and there was no doubt. But how could I prove that he was following me? He might have been heading the same way and might have just needed a break when I needed one. I mean, it seemed unlikely, but not impossible. To give him the final shred of the benefit of the doubt, and to satisfy my own curiosity, I decided that when I pulled out of the rest area, I would stop in the hard shoulder and make out that I needed to check that my trunk was closed properly. When I saw him peel out behind me, and I caught a real good glimpse of him, I knew that it was the guy I worked with, and I knew he was waiting for me to leave. I was pleased to see him go ahead of me, and relieved to know that no one in my office knew where I was heading on my trip. About an hour passed when I felt my shoulder blades unclench and I began to relax a little. Then, as if to mock that feeling of security, his car pulled up behind mine, and I began to tremble and felt as if it would never stop. I didn't know what to do. I just wanted to get away. You know that gut feeling that people always tell you to listen to? That was screaming at me at this point, and I needed to take evasive action now. I was in the fast lane of the express highway, and I pulled all the way across to the other lane to peel out at the next exit right at the last second, so he wasn't expecting it. I had booked 3 nights away in 2 locations, but decided to cancel my plans at the first location and go straight to the second. I just felt for sure if he had followed me this far, then he might know where I was headed. But I had to get back on the highway, and I was scared. I sat in my car with the lights out down a dark lane and planned my route. I used the Maps app on my phone to make a route which would completely bypass the highway that I assumed he was still on. To be honest, looking back on it, I should have just gone home. I was looking over my shoulder the whole time, and it wasn't going to exactly be a relaxing break. I didn't see him again though, thankfully. And when I got back to work, I checked the roster to see if he was supposed to be on holiday at the same time I was. I mean, our office wasn't exactly Wall Street. There were just 6 employees, and I'd had to schedule my holiday months in advance to get it authorized. It just didn't add up. But I learned that he was on bereavement leave the same time I was on holiday. It was a really awkward situation to be in, and I wanted to talk to someone at work about this, but I was nervous too, since I was the only female employee. After some careful consideration, I took the plunge and told the director what had happened. And as I kind of expected, the director told me that he couldn't take my eyewitness statement as proof that my co-worker had stalked me. I remember him saying, "What do you want me to do about it? You're a single attractive woman and this happened off of company property. I don't know what to tell you." In the following weeks and months, I tried my best to find other employment in my little town. We'd had our end-of-year party, and I announced that I was leaving. It was a shame, though, because if it hadn't have been for that creep, I might still be working there. But even though I knew he was following me deep down, I always doubted myself. I thought that it could have been a coincidence, and that I could have been imagining things, for instance. I kept in touch with some of the people from my old workplace, and I would often ask about the company. After the 6 or 7 years since I quit, I ran into someone from those days and we got to talking. It turned out that the guy who'd followed me all those years ago was now in prison for breaking and entering, and a crime so intimate and violent it shouldn't be mentioned. My blood ran cold when I heard that, and I knew then that my gut feeling saved me that day. I'm so glad I cancelled my trip to the first hotel. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.